Welcome to Wordpath, the show about Oklahoma Indian languages and the people who are teaching and preserving them. Tonight's program is about factors in language shift in Guatemala and in Oklahoma. We'll be hearing from Dr. Susan Garzon, an associate professor of English at Oklahoma State University in Stillwater in the TESOL and Linguistics program. TESOL, by the way, stands for Teaching English as a Second Language. The program teaches students how to effectively teach English to speakers of other languages. But as an anthropological linguist, Sue has worked extensively on Mayan languages, doing sociolinguistic fieldwork for her MA degree in Mexico and for her PhD in Guatemala. Sue Garzon is one of the co-authors of a book that was recently published by the University of Texas Press, titled The Life of Our Language, Kaqchiquel, Maya, Maintenance, Shift, and Revitalization. Her co-authors are R. McKenna Brown, Julia Becker Richards, and Arnulfo Simon. One highlight is the chapter written by Arnulfo Simon, who is Mayan himself. He writes about his experience of his language and its recent history, beginning with telling what it was like to go to school and feel all the pressure to learn Spanish and hearing his culture disrespected in school. He also talks about the emotional pain of assimilation, and after he realizes and gets some perspective on what he's losing, he talks about, quote, restoration of my culture within myself. It's a very personal and moving chapter, and one that I think Oklahomans can relate to. You'll see that a lot of the same issues and factors can be seen in the situation of indigenous languages in Central America and in Oklahoma. There are a lot of connections and parallels. Let's listen to Sue Garzon speaking from Stillwater. Question. Well, Sue, what are some of the connections between the language situation in Central America and in Oklahoma?
I'm going to talk mostly about Guatemala because that's the country that I have the most experience with. And certainly one thing that really impressed me when I came back to Oklahoma, one similarity was that in both places there's a small group of people who are really committed to language revitalization. Both cultural and language revitalization, but people who really care about the language and who are willing to make really large personal sacrifices to see that their language is passed on. And I think a lot of times there are people who have a real commitment to their own communities. I know in Comalapa, the town in Guatemala where I worked, some of these were young people and they were professional, and they maintained a home in Comalapa. That's where their families were, and then they would commute to Guatemala City sometimes to work, which it was 2 hours each way. It was it was really a major sacrifice, but they did that partly to maintain their connection with the community, and they really wanted to help their own people, their own community, and see that their children and their grandchildren would continue speaking the language. And I have found here in Oklahoma that there's a similar group of people who have just a genuine commitment and are really willing to make personal sacrifices to see that their language will go on. And I think that one of the reasons that I've stayed with looking at Native American languages is because it's so personally satisfying to know those people and to work with them. Those are people I would like to be. I would like to be like them. I enjoy knowing them, and they're among the finest people I've ever known. And it was really nice to come back here and find that there was a really similar group here to the one that I had known in the Mayan area in Guatemala.
Yeah. It's nice to be around that kind of dedication, isn't it? Real commitment. You mentioned Comalapa and the Mayan-speaking community there. Maybe before we go on, you should explain a little bit about the Mayan language, which is really Mayan languages. There isn't just one, right? I know you've done work both in Guatemala and in Mexico. Maybe you could explain what the Mayan languages are and where they're spoken a little bit.
Yeah, there are about 30 Mayan languages. The greatest number are spoken in Guatemala, but there are also quite a few in Mexico, particularly southern Mexico, but up into the Yucatan. And there are some speakers of Mayan languages in Belize, and I think a few in Honduras. And the Mayan language area was a large language area. People started speaking Mayan probably 4,000 years ago, in the highlands, probably the highlands of Guatemala, and they spread out from there and went quite a ways actually. And as they spread out, the languages became what had once been one language became distinct languages. So now there's really a variety of languages. And when the languages are close to each other, frequently people will be able to understand some, kind of the way a Spanish speaker might understand a fair amount of Portuguese, for instance. I was in the Kaqchiquel speaking area, and there are related languages around there. Kaqchiquel and Quiche are related. But then the language that I studied in Mexico was very distantly related. That was Teco. It was a part of another branch of the Mayan language family. So it's a good-sized family, and there are a number of languages spoken over a large geographic area.
And of course, I guess one of the parallels between the Central America setting and the Oklahoma setting is that in each case there was a European language which sort of imposed itself upon the native languages. And of course, in the area where you were working, that language is Spanish rather than English. But there are a lot of changes that happened once Spanish moved in and started sort of attempting to push the other languages out of the way.
Right.
Yeah, I know you use a term in the book quite frequently, with the technical term of language shift. Maybe you could explain what that is exactly, and is that something that has also occurred in Oklahoma?
Yeah, in Guatemala, when I talk about language shift, I'm talking about people no longer using the Mayan language, for instance, Kaqchiquel, the language I was speaking, but speaking only Spanish. And then here in the United States, of course, it would be people no longer speaking the Native American language, which might be any of the languages here, and only speaking English. So, and it can be kind of a gradual process for a while, and then frequently it really becomes kind of a fast process once a generation of parents stop speaking the language with their children. And after that, even though you continue to hear the language spoken in the community because the older people speak it, the end can come fairly quickly, because as the elders die, there is no longer anyone there to speak the language.
Yeah, that certainly is very similar to the situation here.
Yeah.
I think some of our Oklahoma viewers might be surprised, though, that since there was such an intense contact with the Spanish language so long ago, and my impression is much more pressure at an early date than we have among most Oklahoma tribes, it may seem surprising that the Mayan languages are still spoken at all and in such numbers. How many speakers are there?
Oh, of Mayan languages, I'm not sure what the total is. There are about 500,000 Kaqchiquel speakers.
Really, that many? And that's after, 500 years or more of contact.
Right, and some of the Mayan languages actually have more speakers. There are 4 large Mayan languages, Kaqchiquel, Quiche, Mam, and Kaqchi, and they have, a few million speakers anyway.
Well, what I wanted to ask is, I think it's amazing there are so many speakers still, and maybe you can explain in a minute, why that is, what some of the factors are, and yet on the other hand we have languages like Delaware and Oto and other languages in the state of Oklahoma today which have far fewer speakers and are so seemingly closer to the brink than some of these Mayan languages that you've studied. Why does one language seem to shift more quickly than another? What are the factors in that?
Yeah, that's kind of a complex question. One thing to take into account when comparing this area here in Oklahoma or the United States in general and Mesoamerica, Guatemala, and Mexico is that the conquest took kind of different forms there. In Guatemala and Mexico, when the Spaniards came in, they came in to become wealthy. They wanted wealth, and they were willing to use the Indians. They wanted the Indians' labor in order to make them wealthy. So they didn't actually want to get rid of the Indians. They wanted to use them, and they wanted to exploit them. It was not a lovely process, and many people, a huge number of people died following the conquest. But here in the United States, some of the same things happened. A lot of people died due to disease and everything. But in some ways, it was an even worse process, because I think that for the most part, the English and other Europeans who came to settle this country wanted to get rid of the Indians. They wanted the land themselves. They didn't have any use for the Indians, so they were just as glad to get rid of them. And I think that when we look at the Spaniards at the time of the conquest and the English at the time of the conquest, we have more sympathetic feelings toward the English because here these were family people who wanted to come and start a new life and settle. On the other hand, from the Indian point of view, in some ways it was an even worse situation. There was no place for the Indians, for the indigenous population, for the Europeans here. And in Mesoamerica, there was a place, even though it was a place as a subordinated group and a really exploited group. So there was a long period when you had Spaniards and Mayas living in the same country, but the Mayan languages were maintained. And part of the reason, too, was that the Spaniards really excluded the Mayas from participation in national life. They were kind of crowded. They had a relatively dispersed settlement pattern before the conquest, and after the conquest, the Spaniards pulled them together into communities and kind of controlled them there, so that they really couldn't travel much or get out. And if you know much about Guatemalan society, at the upper levels, it's very close-knit. People have kind of tight social networks, and you get things done by going through your uncle and your brother-in-law and your all the people who are related to you in various ways. And if you're not into that social network, it's hard to get in. And of course, Indians have not been. I mean, they're just starting to move into national life now. But they were really cut off for a long time. And that was bad because they couldn't participate in the life of their own country, even though they were the great majority of the people. On the other hand, in some ways they were able to maintain their culture, their language and culture. And I think that people took a lot of satisfaction from community life, from maintaining rituals, from maintaining a large part of the Mayan culture, actually. That was how they found meaning in their lives under very difficult circumstances. So the fact that the Spaniards excluded them from national life had both good and bad results.
Yeah, I can see, tell me if I'm wrong, but I can see maybe two big differences there. One is that in what's now Oklahoma, there was early on a big push, with land allotment, there was an attempt to make sure that Indians of a given tribe were not crowded together in a community of their own. They were actually interspersed with Europeans and other people allotted land in other ways. And so there was a conscious attempt to divide them, as opposed to pushing them off together somewhere. I know the situation was different in reservation days and in some other states, but a lot of the Oklahoma tribes have that kind of history. And another difference is that the United States government started putting up these boarding schools, and they said that they were trying very hard, in effect, to make good Europeans out of the Indians, and they were trying to pull them into the society rather than keeping them out at arm's length. So I can see those two factors alone could have made a very large difference.
Yeah, the boarding schools had a really, at least early on, had a really bad effect on Native American languages here. Actually, I found that there's kind of a similar attitude toward the educational system, and I found this in Mexico too, in Mexico and Guatemala, and here the people often blame the schools for loss of the language, and there's something to that, because when the kids went to school, the teachers usually did not want to deal with the Native American language. They wouldn't allow the children to speak it, and I think that happened both places. It was harder here in some ways because the children were taken away from their families. There, usually they were at home with their families, but if they went to school, they couldn't use their own language except when they were talking to each other. And in one of those huge classes, I'm sure that they did some of it.
Yes.
But the schools, I think, in both places really discouraged use of the language. And I think for quite a long time, even if there was some education available in Guatemala, the people didn't really see much use for it. In fact, it wasn't very good education, and usually people wouldn't get more than a year or two anyway. And you can see that it was really irrelevant to them. It was irrelevant to their lives. One of my co-authors in the book, Arnulfo Simon, talks about growing up in Comalapa and what the educational system was like there. And here he was, a Mayan kid in this Mayan area with all these Mayas, and in school Mayas were only brought up once, and some teacher, I think, said, well, once there was a civilization of Mayas and then they disappeared. And, Arnold felt like, did they come from nothing?
Yes.
They were just cut off from their own history, even in their own country. They were given no sense that they had an identity and importance. And I think to some extent that's probably happened here too. Indian kids have not traditionally learned much about themselves and their own culture. The teachers have not been Indian, and that was certainly true in Guatemala too. The teachers were outsiders and really had no interest in Mayan culture and Mayas. So it's been kind of a similar situation where the educational system just helped to keep them subordinate in some ways, and cut them off from their own history.
Yeah. Very sad, very much like here, it sounds like. Well, what has all of this history and what have these policies brought us to today in terms of Kaqchiquel Mayan? I know that Spanish has moved in on the language a lot, and there has been language shift, but how many speakers are there, and what is the situation? Where is the language used, and how endangered is it today?
Yeah. There are about 500,000 speakers, which makes it sound not endangered, but in fact it is. The only monolingual Kaqchiquel speakers are old people for the most part. They tend to be older women, in fact. Most of the men are bilingual, even the older men. The middle-aged people would be bilingual. They would speak Kaqchiquel and Spanish. And then there are a fair number of children who are just growing up with Spanish. They aren't taught Kaqchiquel in the home. Their parents speak Spanish with each other and with the children. So there is much less Kaqchiquel being spoken. I mean, they would still speak Kaqchiquel perhaps with their grandparents, but in another generation the grandparents will be bilingual. There will be no real need to speak Kaqchiquel with them.
Right.
Now there's more Kaqchiquel spoken in some of the villages, in the more remote areas. The town where I was had a population of about 27,000, and it had regular contact with Guatemala City, which is about 2 hours away. So for instance, there were buses that went into Guatemala City and into intermediary towns several times a day, and people took them often. And some of the villages that were actually part of the municipality of Comalapa were near the road, so that people from there could also take the buses. But some of them were far away, in the mountains, and it was maybe several hours of walking to get into Comalapa. And people would come in on market day sometimes, and somebody would have a truck with benches in it, and people would sit there and come into the market. And some of those people, actually, I think some of the women worked as kind of servants in Comalapa for some of the people there. But that was a group that was more likely to be conservative, that would be more likely to be monolingual in Kaqchiquel. Otherwise, most people are either bilingual in Kaqchiquel or Spanish, or in the case of children, some of them are just Spanish speakers.
Well, so that brings the language there to a similar state to really all of the Native American languages, I think, in this country now, which is that kind of passing on from generation to generation has been interrupted, and there has to be some conscious teaching of the language, some language preservation efforts. What kinds of things are being done along those lines with Kaqchiquel?
Yeah, well, all of the Mayan languages have been are undergoing revitalization to some extent. And let me say, there are some smaller Mayan languages that are actually in a similar situation to the languages spoken here in Oklahoma, some of the small languages. One Mayan language, Chicomuceltec, actually died out. I think it's either last century or earlier in this century. And there are others that don't have very many speakers, so that's similar. But there's now an Academy of Mayan Languages, which is recognized by the national government, and then each of the languages, or at least the ones that I know of, have their own academy too, and the people working in them are dedicated to maintaining the language and carrying out some different kinds of activities, like getting dictionaries and grammars out and standardizing the language to some extent. So there's a lot of linguistic work being done. And there were linguists who went in fairly early and started working on the language and trained Guatemalan trained Mayas to be linguists too. So there are a lot of Mayas actually. There are several Kaqchiquels that I know of, and Quiches and others who are working on their own languages, which is, yeah, it's a really nice thing. A lot of them are fairly young, maybe in their 20s, 30s, or maybe 40s, but not in their 70s.
Right.
They're young people who still have a career ahead of them, and frequently they grew up in Mayan towns and learned the Mayan language. Often they were poor, they came from poor families, but there have been more opportunities opening up, more educational opportunities, and some of them, again, through considerable sacrifice, have taken advantage of them and are now working on language. Some of them are in education, a lot of them are in education, some of them are in linguistics or anthropology, areas like that. So there's a real move now to revitalize the languages. And I know that when I went down there at the beginning, I knew quite a few young people who were interested in language maintenance, but they were speaking Spanish with their children. And by the time I left a few years later, I noticed that they were making a bigger effort to speak the Mayan language with their children.
Great.
Yeah, so I think that they were realizing that it was going to be partly up to them, and that was not easy. It's not easy to break a language habit, to go from speaking one language to another with members of your family. So, I give them a lot of credit for doing that.
Are any of these Mayan languages taught in the schools now, in the public schools?
Not very much. Actually, when I went to Comalapa, I wanted to know if the kids were still learning Kaqchiquel or not, and we did some testing of the kids in the public school, and the idea got around that maybe bilingual education was going to start in Comalapa, and people were really upset. At least some people were upset because the bilingual education that exists has been in the rural areas. It's been with children who spoke Kaqchiquel as a first language, and the people in Comalapa, I think, felt more sophisticated than that. They felt like bilingual education was for something for rural areas more. But when I left, they had started teaching Kaqchiquel in the grade school. So they were, and I don't know, I think maybe it's not very much. Maybe it's an hour a week or something. It's not a lot, but it's something, and people accept it, and it gives legitimacy to the language, something that it never had before. I mean, it may have had internal legitimacy in the Kaqchiquel community, but it didn't have legitimacy from the outside. And now I think more people understand that Kaqchiquel is a real language. And I think that that's actually another similarity. People here in this country, I think, have often thought people just spoke Indian and didn't realize how many language families there are, how many languages there are, that they are indeed languages with full grammars that are in every way equivalent to English or Spanish or any of the languages, the European languages that we think of. And I think it was the same thing in Guatemala. People, when they talked about the Mayan languages, they didn't talk about them as languages. They talked about them as tongues or dialect or something like that, something that had less legitimacy than a real language. And I think now people are becoming more aware that these really are genuine languages, that deserve the same kind of treatment as Spanish or any other language.
Great. What about written materials? Is there a recognized writing system for Kaqchiquel, for instance?
Yeah, it's been a difficult process deciding on a writing system for Mayan languages. Now, Mayan languages were written in glyphs before the conquest, so there is actually a long tradition of writing, but that was stopped at the conquest. And then there were some materials that were written in Kaqchiquel and in some of the other Mayan languages with the alphabet shortly after the conquest. But then most of that writing tradition dropped out too. I think it was kept in the Yucatan longer than other areas, but people weren't really writing the Mayan language. And then different people started writing it, and at the time that I went down there was a push to come up with a uniform system for writing Kaqchiquel, because people were publishing in it, and they were publishing with different alphabets. the problem was that people had kind of a vested interest and an emotional interest in some of these alphabets. Sometimes they had been involved in creating them. One of them had been designed by, for instance, in terms of the quiches, one of the writing systems had been designed by a quiche man that people really revered. In some ways, it wasn't. It was a little hard to use because the symbols don't show up on a keyboard. You know, it was kind of unwieldy in some ways, but people wanted to honor the designer of the language, of the writing system, and so they were reluctant to give it up. And actually, they did in the end. They were willing to give on that. And then other groups also had a vested interest in different writing systems, and there was kind of a struggle over choosing one. And at one point, there was a meeting in Antigua, Guatemala, and people were invited from all over, and they ended up discussing the different writing systems and voting on one. And
now, were
only the
these Mayan people or more researchers and such?
Only the Mayas could vote. The Ministry of Education, of course, does a lot of printing in Mayan languages, and they are using I believe they are using the writing system that was decided upon.
Even though the particular conditions in Oklahoma and Guatemala have made for some differences, I think we can certainly learn from each other's experiences and look to each other for possible solutions to language problems. See you next time on Wordpath.
Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwara kita, wa pene madaone kita. Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwara kita, wa pene madaone kita. Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwara kita, wa pene madaone kita. Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwara kita, wa pene mada.